Today's verse of the week is found in John 20, verse 21. Then said Jesus to them again, Peace be unto you. As my Father hath sent me, even so send I you. Margaret Clarkson was a gifted natural writer. She published hundreds of poems, articles, songs, and sketches, as well as 17 books, which have been translated into several languages. Yet today few know her name. There is very little written about her online, and what you do find generally revolves around one hymn she wrote. It was a hymn she wrote while teaching far from home. Here's what she says about the inspiration for the hymn, So Send I You. In 1935, teaching jobs were so scarce that I had to take my first job as a teacher in a lumber camp some 1,400 miles from home, out in the Rainy River district of northwestern Ontario. From there, I moved to the gold mining camp of Kirkland Lake, 450 miles north of Toronto. In all, I spent 7 years in the north. I experienced loneliness of every kind, mental, cultural, but particularly spiritual, for in all of those 7 years, I never found real Christian fellowship. Churches were modern, born-again Christians almost non-existent. I was studying the Word one night and meditating on the loneliness of my situation, and it came to my mind to read John 20 and the words, So send I you. Because of a physical disability, I knew that I could never go to the mission field, but God seemed to tell me that one night that this was my mission field. This was where He had sent me. I was then 23, in my 3rd year of teaching. I had written and published verse all of my life, so it was natural to put my thoughts into verse. The physical disability that hindered Margaret from going to the mission field was a problem that plagued her throughout her life. She was bedbound with juvenile arthritis when she was 3 and often suffered migraines. Another arthritic attack happened at age 12, which settled in her arm, leaving her wrist and hand swollen and partially crippled for several years. It seems she also had a slight malformation in her lower spine, which required surgery later in life. She would continue to battle arthritis throughout her life, which spread rapidly, attacking almost all her joints and eventually forcing her into early retirement. Yet she continued to pen hymns and books to point others to the Savior. Let's look now at the words of the hymn she penned while alone in the Canadian gold mining camp. So send I you. So send I you to labor unrewarded, to serve unpaid, unloved, unsought, unknown, to bear rebuke, to suffer scorn and scoffing. So send I you to toil for me alone. So send I you to bind the bruised and broken, or wandering souls to work, to weep, to wake, to bear the burdens of a world aweary. So send I you to suffer for my sake. So send I you to loneliness and longing, with heart a-hungering for the loved and known, forsaking home and kindred, friend and dear one. So send I you to know my love alone. So send I you to leave your life's ambition, to die to dear desire self-will resign, to labor long and love where men revile you. So send I you to lose your life in mine. So send I you to hearts made hard by hatred, to eyes made blind because they will not see, to spend though it be blood, to spend and spare not. So send I you to taste of Calvary. This hymn is recognized as one of the finest missionary hymns of the 20th century. It was first published in 1954, 16 years after Margaret wrote it in the mining camp. But something changed in Margaret's thinking. She came to believe So Send I You was one-sided, and she wrote new lyrics that she believed were more biblically balanced between the trials and joys of the Christian. And here are those words. So send I you, by grace made strong to triumph, or host of hell, or darkness, death, and sin, my name to bear, and in that name to conquer. So send I you, my victory to win. So send I you to take the souls in bondage, the word of truth that sets the captive free, to break the bonds of sin, to loose death's fetters. So send I you to bring the lost to me. So send I you, my strength to know in weakness, my joy in grief, my perfect peace in pain, to prove my power, my grace, my promised presence. So send I you, eternal fruit to gain. So send I you to bear my cross with patience, and then one day with joy to lay it down, to hear my voice, well done, my faithful servant, come share my throne, my kingdom, and my crown. As the Father hath sent me, so send I you. By the time Margaret created these new verses, the first 5 verses had taken hold, and few people then or even now were aware that she had written additional verses for the hymn from a fresh perspective. I believe personally that both versions are good, but also that the heartfelt nature of the original is the one that personally, what's the expression? It tugs at your heartstrings. It's the one that kind of epitomizes what missionary work is like, what we think of when we think about missionaries. So let's look at the verses of this hymn again and make some observations about them, particularly the original 5. So let me read that first set of words again. So the first verse, as we would say, is, so send I you to labor unrewarded, to serve unpaid, unloved, unsought, unknown, to bear rebuke, to suffer scorn and scoffing. So send I you to toil for me alone. Missionaries today in parts of Europe and in some first world countries still deal with these things. It honestly probably is really all around the world, but we can see it maybe the easiest in certain parts of Europe and in certain first world countries, that their work may feel in the moment unrewarded. When they see few people getting saved, people not living right, or people not even having the slightest interest in hearing the gospel. I saw this in France. The missionaries who I was able to visit, they've worked for so many years faithfully there in France, and yet they don't have much to show for it in the way of people attending church or converts. But their faithfulness is what's important. And so their labor has been unrewarded. They don't see the fruit of their labor like people see in other countries. There's a missionary that I know who's serving in Europe, and his brother serves in a country in the West Indies. And the older brother is in Europe, younger brother is in West Indies. I'm not going to mention their names, but the older brother, he was mentioning one time, talking to him, that it's a little bit hard to continue working, to keep being faithful when you're not seeing a lot of results, and yet across the world your brother is in a thriving church. You're helping to start something that's really growing, and that's very hard. We have that comparison nowadays. They didn't in the past, but that makes it very, very difficult. Now, this part of the hymn also talks about to serve unpaid. Now, very few missionaries serve completely unpaid today, but some still work on a very small amount. So often, business-minded people look at the work of missions and they cannot see the numbers to justify supporting a missionary. They can't justify, it's like, I'm not getting a good return on my investment. Now, William Carey, for example, a missionary to India, he worked for 7 years before he saw his first convert. And it makes sense in the culture of India that it would take so long to see a result there. Now, this extended length of time was not due to Carey being lazy or inefficient, but it was due to the culture and the strength of people's belief in their own religion. Now, the last line is very powerful. It says, so send I you to toil for me alone. Missionaries are working for the Lord, just as Jesus was mocked, scorned, and ridiculed, so are those who share the gospel with others. I don't want to just flippantly say, oh, that's just part of it, but it is true. If you are trying to serve the Lord, or you're trying to explain to people, teach people suffer scorn and scoffing, the very rebuke. You're being unsought, unloved, unknown. There's some countries where missionaries are not wanted. It's like they don't want you to be there, and so you are unloved. You're unsought. People won't come seek you out, and so it is a very tough situation. And yet many people faithfully do it in the past and present. It's amazing. Let's go on to the second verse, which says, "So send I you to bind the bruised and broken, or wandering souls to work, to weep, to wake, to bear the burdens of a world aweary. So send I you to suffer for my sake." Missionaries help people in a variety of circumstances, whether the people are well-to-do and just need someone to share their troubles with, or have very little and need help to get medicine or see a doctor. I was in West Africa when a member of the church, his wife was having a baby, but she had a very difficult pregnancy. The missionary I was working with used his vehicle in the middle of the night as an ambulance to get that woman and her husband to a good hospital, where she gave birth to her very sweet little girl. So missionaries will use their own resources, their time and their energy to help those they are serving. They'll give up time with their family. They'll put their lives at risk sometimes to go and help. Missionaries will think about and weep over those they invest time in, who then steal from them. But these missionaries, they will remain. They will weep. They would wonder what they could do differently, but they will continue to suffer those betrayals for Jesus' sake. They're trying to reach people not just for the here and now, but for the everlasting. Third verse says, "So send I you to loneliness and longing, with heart a-hungering for the loved and known, forsaking home and kindred, friend and dear one. So send I you to know my love alone." Today, missionaries have access in most places to 24/7 internet that will allow them to connect with family, friends, and stay up to date on affairs in their home country. Yet still, as the missionaries in the past who would wait weeks, months, and sometimes in the early days, years for letters to arrive from home, it's still a lonely work. In most cases, a missionary is separated from their family, their culture, and much that is familiar to them. So in addition to trying to share the gospel, they are adapting to life in a country that is very different from their own. This causes many to hunger for the loved and known, and is still, in my observation, the leading cause of missionaries coming off the field. Having to deal with something that's different, being away from family, cultural differences. Sometimes the idea of being a missionary and the reality of what that will be like cannot be grasped until you are in the midst. When you go on a survey trip and know in the back of your mind that this is only for a week, 2 weeks, or a month, you can push through and deal with the situation, deal with the culture, the way of life, the differences. But once you land with all your worldly possessions and realize that you were there for, most mission terms now were 2 to 5 years, then reality sinks in, and that hunger for the loved and known begins to kick in. It's our flesh being like, "Hey, don't you want to be comfortable? Don't you want to go back to where things are better?" And that is something that missionaries have to deal with. So verse 4 says, "So send I you to leave your life's ambitions, to die to dear desires self-will resign, to labor long and love where men revile you. So send I you to lose your life and mind." From a child, we dream of what we will be when we grow up. We have ambitions, desires that we want to pursue. Yet God asks all of us, not just missionaries, to leave our life's ambitions, to die to dear desire and self-will resign. He asks us to labor long and to even love when people revile us. And this is for all Christians, so that we can lose our lives in His. Luke 9:23 says, "If any man will come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me." This verse of the song is very easy to just pin it on the missionaries. Oh, that's something a missionary has to go do. But no, this is for all of us. Many times we will get to do what we desire. Our ambitions will help to further the gospel. But there may be times when there's things that we need to deny ourselves, to give up, in order to follow Christ, to take up his cross daily and follow him. All right, now the last verse says, "So send I you to hearts made hard by hatred, to eyes made blind because they will not see, to spend though it be blood, to spend and spare not. So send I you to taste of Calvary." When I read this verse, I instantly think of people like Jim Elliot, Nate Saint, Roger Udarian, Ed McCully, and Pete Fleming, who died in Ecuador. I also think about John and Betty Stam in China, and more recently, Charles Wesco in Cameroon. People who were willing to go to the mission field, and for one way or the other, whether through tribal fear, outright persecution, or just being in what we would say is the wrong place at the wrong time, lost their lives on the mission field. And this is just a handful of people who spent, though it be blood, they spent and spared not. Thinking specifically of Jim Elliot and his friends, they died trying to reach the unreached in Ecuador. They were willing to give their lives to reach these people. Regardless of the region of the world, missionaries go to those whose hearts are made hard by hatred, hatred of religion, hatred of a missionary's nationality, and just hatred in general. And there are eyes who are blind to the gospel because they choose not to see. They refuse to see the truth. And all of this is about a taste of Calvary. It can't fully, no one can even partway taste what Jesus tasted at Calvary. But this is just a minute, a small taste of Calvary. Being willing to give your life for others. Whenever I read this hymn, missionary names, missionary stories, they just pop up in my mind. Reading about things they dealt with, all of the trials and the struggles are summed up so neatly in this hymn. A few years back, I was able to spend time in West Africa, and I wrote the words to two different hymns in my Bible. One was "Anywhere with Jesus," and the other were the words to "So Send I You." And occasionally while I was there, I would read the words to these hymns and think about their meaning, not only for myself, but for all missionaries. When I was in West Africa, the country I was in, there were cell towers, but very few. Once a week or so, I could visit the office of a gold mining company. So yes, like Margaret Clarkson, I lived in a gold mining town, and you could connect to the internet. And for me, it was a luxury I always appreciated, the ability to connect with family via phone or internet. But when I think about Mary Slessor, William Carey, David Livingstone, Hudson Taylor, all of these different missionaries, they had people all around them they could communicate with. But their extended family, many of their friends, were far away, with letters being the only means of communication. And at the time, the mail was only as fast as the ships that could sail between continents. So this would also require one to write letters. You had to be willing to write letters for letters to be sent. You couldn't just pick up a phone and just chat. Some people prefer verbal communication over written communication. So if you weren't the best written communicator, you might not hear a lot from people. They might not respond. They might not send letters. So I think of David Livingstone at one point in his life, he either stopped writing letters or simply his letters were getting lost, which resulted in the journalist Henry Stanley being sent into the heart of Africa to find out whether the explorer missionary doctor was still alive. Those famous words, Dr. Livingstone, I presume. And so people didn't know. If something happened, people didn't know. Modern missions, we have so many conveniences. I wouldn't say that it makes things easier. I wouldn't say it makes things easy. It makes things easier, but it doesn't make things easy. it's a blessing, but it can also be a curse, you might say, because David Livingstone didn't know what was happening back at home. He was able to focus fully on what was happening around him. I'm sure he thought about his kids at some point, at some points, thought about them, what's happening, what's going on. But for the most part, he, like Mary Slessor, they were very focused on what was happening there and the work that they were doing. I'm not saying the missionaries today should cut off all communication with the outside world. Don't talk to anyone, just focus on your work. But I think that it was an advantage that they had. They weren't being reminded about things back home. Like, pop up Instagram today, and you can see what your family and friends are doing. And that can be hard. You think about what you're missing out on. So for Margaret Clarkson, being so far, 1,400 miles away from home in her early 20s, that had to be very, very hard for her. So you can understand the, I don't want to necessarily say pain, but I guess the pain, the sorrow, the discouragement that comes in the words of this hymn. So take the time. There's so much to this hymn. There's so many good words. You go and read through the second version as well, the new words that she wrote. But think about missionaries. Think about what I don't want to glorify them and like, oh, what they've given up. But it is true that many have given up a lot to go to the mission field. If they're a very close family, or family members who have health issues, and they know, I'm going to be away. If something happens, I won't be able to get back home to help my family. There's a lot that missionaries deal with, not just in day-to-day, how do I reach people with the gospel, but the emotions of being away from home, their family. There's a lot. So think of this hymn, So Send I You, and think about missionaries. Pray for missionaries. Remember for them that these are hard struggles, and that we should be reminded to pray more for missionaries. Well, thank you for listening to the God's Peculiar People podcast. Apologize, there wasn't an episode last week. Had some technical difficulties. Hoping to keep things going. Have a plan for the summer that kind of came to me. So we'll talk about that in next week's episode, what the plan is for the summer. It will involve talking more about Mary Slessor. I think you'll find it interesting. Hopefully you'll find it interesting. I'm very excited about it, so hopefully it will work out well. But I will have a question for you next week, so make sure you're listening, and we'll talk about that more next time. But thank you for listening to the podcast. If you really enjoyed, if you'd leave a review or share it with others, that would be awesome, and I would greatly appreciate it. Have a wonderful day, and I'll talk to you next time on the God's Peculiar People podcast.